The collapse. The early morning sun cast golden hues over the quiet neighborhood of Willow Creek. The suburban streets were lined with towering oaks, their leaves rustling in the gentle autumn breeze. Birds chirped from their perches, a peaceful melody filling the crisp air. Inside a modest yet well-kept home, Thomas Bennett sat alone at the dining table, sipping his morning coffee. The aroma of roasted beans and buttered toast lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of aged books that filled the study next door. At 72 years old, Thomas had long retired from his career as a history professor, yet he still carried himself with the same poise and discipline. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, his dark brown skin smooth despite the lines of wisdom etched into it. His morning routine was sacred, reading the newspaper, sipping coffee, and reflecting on the world's ever-changing state. He flipped through the pages, his keen eyes scanning the headlines. Wars, political scandals, and economic turmoil filled the columns, but none of it surprised him. He sighed, shaking his head. "The world never learns," he muttered under his breath. A sharp pang spread across his chest. He paused, his fingers tightening around the ceramic mug. He dismissed it as indigestion, setting the newspaper down. "Just stress," he murmured. But the pain didn't fade. It grew sharper, spreading like fire through his ribs. He shifted in his seat, rolling his shoulders. In the kitchen, his longtime neighbor and friend, Martha Evans, moved with practiced ease, preparing breakfast. She had taken it upon herself to look after Thomas since his wife's passing, ensuring he never skipped meals. Though she was in her late 60s, she remained spry and quick, her sharp blue eyes always noticing when something was amiss. She emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Thomas, you barely touched your food," she said, placing a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him. "I'm not that hungry this morning," he admitted. Martha frowned, stepping closer. "Are you feeling all right?" He opened his mouth to respond, but another wave of pain stole his breath. His vision wavered, and for the first time in his life, fear flickered in his chest. Martha's eyes widened as she noticed the sudden pallor in his face. "Thomas?" He tried to wave her off, but his hand trembled. The tightness in his chest became unbearable, squeezing the air from his lungs. His heart pounded erratically. Then, his body gave out. The coffee mug slipped from his grasp, shattering against the wooden floor. Martha barely had time to react before Thomas collapsed, his chair tipping over. He hit the ground hard, his breath ragged. "Thomas!" Martha screamed, rushing to his side. Her hands trembled as she grabbed his wrist, feeling for a pulse. It was weak and irregular. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed 911. "Please. I need an ambulance, my friend collapsed. He's having a heart attack." The operator's calm voice guided her through the steps, but panic clouded her thoughts. She pressed her palm against Thomas's chest, whispering prayers under her breath. "Hold on, Thomas. Help is coming." Minutes felt like hours. The distant sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the morning stillness. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, reflecting off the walls. Paramedics burst through the door, their expressions focused and urgent. "What happened?" one of them asked, kneeling beside Thomas. He just collapsed," Martha stammered. "His chest, he was in pain." The lead paramedic pressed a stethoscope against Thomas's chest, listening intently. "His pulse is weak. We need to get him to the hospital now." They worked quickly, securing an oxygen mask over his face and lifting him onto a stretcher. Martha followed them outside, her heart pounding as they loaded Thomas into the ambulance. "Which hospital?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "St. Anthony's," one of the paramedics replied before climbing inside. The doors slammed shut. The sirens blared again as the ambulance sped away. Martha stood frozen on the porch, her hands clasped together. "Michael," she whispered, realizing she needed to call Thomas's son. She hurried inside, grabbing her phone and dialing the number she knew by heart. The line rang once. Twice. Then a groggy voice answered. "Hello? Michael, it's Martha. Your father, he's in trouble. They just took him to the hospital." There was silence on the other end. Then, Michael's voice, sharp and awake. "I'm on my way." Martha exhaled, her hands still trembling. She only hoped it wasn't too late, the hospital's cruel mistake. The ambulance tore through the streets of Willow Creek, sirens wailing as it raced toward St. Anthony's Hospital. Inside, Thomas Bennett lay unconscious on the stretcher, his breathing shallow. A paramedic kept his fingers on Thomas's wrist, monitoring his weak, irregular pulse. Another paramedic prepped the defibrillator, just in case. Heart attack symptoms. "We need to stabilize him the moment we arrive," the lead paramedic said, glancing at the driver. "He doesn't have much time," the younger paramedic muttered. "I've seen this before." The ambulance screeched to a halt outside St. Anthony's emergency entrance. The moment the doors swung open, a team of nurses and doctors rushed forward. 72-year-old male. Possible myocardial infarction. Pulse is weak, one of the paramedics announced as they rolled Thomas into the ER. A tall, stern-faced doctor, Dr. Alan Peters, took one look at Thomas and frowned. He turned to the nurse beside him. "Check his records. Do we have insurance information?" The nurse hesitated. "There's nothing in the system yet. He was just admitted." Dr. Peters pursed his lips. "We don't have time to waste resources on non-paying patients. Let's take his vitals, but unless we have confirmation of insurance, we can't proceed with advanced treatment." The nurses exchanged uneasy glances, but they followed his orders. In a hospital where profit dictated treatment, Thomas had just become a liability. One of the younger nurses, Emily Carter, knelt beside Thomas, taking his vitals. She saw his dark skin, the lines of age and wisdom on his face, and the slight tremble in his fingers. Something about him felt dignified, even in his vulnerable state. "Sir, can you hear me?" she whispered, touching his hand. Thomas groaned, his eyes fluttering open for a moment before closing again. Emily looked up at Dr. Peters. "His pulse is dropping. He needs immediate care." Dr. Peters exhaled sharply. "We don't even know if he has the means to pay." Another nurse, Karen, bit her lip. "He came in unconscious. What if he was mugged? He could have identification in his pockets." "We're not running a charity," Dr. Peters snapped. "There are paying patients waiting for beds. If he doesn't have insurance or a form of payment on file, we can't waste resources." Emily clenched her fists. This wasn't right. As Thomas struggled to breathe, another doctor, Dr. Marshall, approached. Unlike Dr. Peters, he was known for compassion over policy. He glanced at the monitors and frowned. "This man needs immediate care," he said. "Get the crash cart ready." Dr. Peters shook his head. "We're still verifying if he can pay." Dr. Marshall's eyes darkened. "You're telling me you're willing to let this man die over paperwork?" Before Dr. Peters could respond, the hospital administrator, a woman named Susan Hall, arrived. She carried a clipboard and wore an impassive expression. "What's the situation?" she asked. Dr. Peters spoke first. "Patient arrived unconscious. Possible heart attack. No identification, no insurance information on file." Susan frowned. "Has anyone contacted his next of kin?" Emily quickly spoke up. "A woman named Martha was with him. She might know his son's number." Susan sighed. "Until we have a responsible party to verify payment, I'm afraid we have to discharge him." Emily's heart sank. But he's unstable. You can't just throw him out. Susan's tone remained cold. The hospital has policies. If he has no insurance and no means to pay, we can't justify the cost of keeping him here. Dr. Marshall stepped forward. Then I'll take responsibility. I'll oversee his case personally. Susan's eyes narrowed. That's not how this works, Doctor. Dr. Peters smirked. If you're so worried, Marshall, why don't you pay out of pocket for him? Dr. Marshall clenched his jaw. He wanted to fight, but he knew the hospital board wouldn't allow exceptions. Susan turned to the nurses. Prepare for discharge. Emily's stomach twisted as she watched them wheel Thomas toward the exit. Not to intensive care, but out onto the street. Thrown away like trash. The cold morning air bit against Thomas's skin as they pushed his stretcher outside. A hospital security guard stood by, arms crossed. Where do you want us to leave him? One of the orderlies asked. Susan barely looked back. Anywhere out of the way. Emily, feeling sick to her stomach, whispered to Thomas, I'm so sorry. They left him there, on the sidewalk, his hospital gown flapping in the wind. A few passers-by stopped, watching in shock. A homeless man sitting nearby shuffled closer. Hey, man, you okay? Thomas barely stirred. His breathing was weak. His life was slipping away, and the people who were supposed to help had turned their backs. Then, just as fate would have it, his son arrived. The arrival of Michael Bennett. Michael Bennett drove like a man possessed, his heart pounding against his ribs. His father, his rock, his hero, was in trouble. And Martha's frantic voice on the phone had only worsened his fears. He didn't even remember how he had reached St. Anthony's. One moment, he was in traffic, the next, he was sprinting through the hospital doors. Where is my father? Thomas Bennett, he demanded at the front desk. The receptionist barely looked up. I don't see a patient by that name. Michael slammed his hand against the counter. That's impossible. He was just brought in by ambulance. The receptionist hesitated. Oh. I think there was a patient like that, but... But what? He was discharged. Michael's blood ran cold. You discharged him? He was having a heart attack. The receptionist shrugged. I don't make the rules. Something in Michael snapped. He turned, marching toward the ER. Sir, you can't go back there, a nurse called, but he ignored her. He shoved open the double doors and stormed inside. Where is Dr. Peters? Dr. Peters turned around, arms crossed. And you are? I'm Michael Bennett, Thomas Bennett's son. What the hell did you do to my father? Dr. Peters smirked. We followed hospital protocol. If your father doesn't have insurance or the ability to pay, we cannot. Michael cut him off. You threw out an elderly man having a heart attack because of money? Dr. Peters scoffed. I'm sure he'll be fine. If you want him treated, take him somewhere that can afford charity cases. Michael saw red. He lunged, grabbing Dr. Peters by the collar. You arrogant piece of... Before he could land a punch, another nurse ran in, breathless. Sir, your father, he's outside. He needs help. Michael's stomach twisted. He turned and ran. When he saw his father, shivering on the pavement, barely breathing, something inside him broke. He fell to his knees beside Thomas. Dad! I'm here. Thomas's eyes flickered open. His lips moved, but no sound came. Michael clenched his jaw. Then he turned toward the hospital, his eyes dark with fury. They were going to pay for this. The wrath of a son. A storm brewing. Michael's hands trembled as he gripped his father's frail shoulders, his pulse hammering in his ears. The sight of Thomas, shivering, pale, and gasping for breath on the cold sidewalk, seared into his mind like a fresh wound. His father was a strong man, a man who had built his life from the ground up, and now he was discarded like trash, left to die on the pavement outside a hospital. Michael turned his face toward the hospital doors, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. They did this. They, the doctors, the administrators, the entire corrupt system that placed money over human lives. His eyes darkened with fury. "Hold on, Dad," he whispered, pulling out his phone. His fingers flew across the screen as he called 911. "Emergency services, what's your location?" a dispatcher answered. "My father is having a cardiac emergency, right outside St. Anthony's Hospital. They threw him out instead of treating him. We need an ambulance, now." There was a pause. The dispatcher's voice grew more alert. "Wait, they discharged a heart attack patient onto the street?" Michael's voice was ice. "Yes. And if he dies because of this, you'll be investigating a lawsuit instead of an emergency. Sending paramedics now. ETA 2 minutes." Michael hung up and immediately dialed another number, one that carried even more weight than 911. It rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. "Michael?" "Uncle Jacob," Michael breathed, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "Dad is in trouble. And this damn hospital, they threw him out." A long silence. Then. "Where are you?" "Outside St. Anthony's." "I'm on my way." Click. Michael knew exactly what was about to happen. His uncle, Jacob Carter, wasn't just any man, he was a powerful civil rights attorney, one of the most feared legal minds in the country. And he wasn't just coming to help Thomas, he was coming to tear this hospital apart. A public scene. The flashing lights of the approaching ambulance painted the hospital's entrance in streaks of red and blue. The paramedics leaped out and rushed toward Michael and his father. "Sir, can you hear me?" one of them asked, kneeling beside Thomas. Thomas groaned weakly. His breathing was labored, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven movements. He was inside," Michael said, his voice hoarse. "They refused treatment. Said he didn't have insurance. They threw him out." One of the paramedics' faces hardened. "That's illegal. Hospitals have a legal obligation to stabilize emergency patients, insurance or not." Michael's hands curled into fists. "And yet, here we are." The paramedics quickly got to work, attaching leads to Thomas's chest to monitor his heart. The EKG's beeping was irregular. "This is bad," the lead paramedic muttered. "His heart is barely hanging on. We need to move him, now." Michael stood up. "Where are you taking him?" The paramedic didn't hesitate. "Anywhere but here." Just as they started loading Thomas into the ambulance, a luxury black SUV pulled up to the curb. Michael turned just in time to see Jacob Carter step out. The power of the right name. Jacob was a towering figure, a man in his late 50s with a distinguished salt and pepper beard, dressed in an immaculate three-piece suit. His presence alone commanded instant respect, and fear. He surveyed the situation in one glance, the paramedics, the unconscious man on the stretcher, and his nephew shaking with fury. Then, his cold, piercing eyes settled on the hospital doors. Jacob turned to Michael. "Tell me everything." Michael's voice was like steel. "They refused to treat Dad. Said he didn't have insurance. They threw him out like garbage." A muscle ticked in Jacob's jaw. "Who made that call?" "Dr. Alan Peters," Michael said, spitting the name like venom. "And the hospital administrator, Susan Hall." Jacob nodded once. Then, without another word, he marched toward the hospital entrance. Michael followed, his fury boiling over. A reckoning inside the hospital. The moment Jacob and Michael stormed through the ER doors, Every pair of eyes turned toward them. The nurses exchanged nervous glances. Dr. Peters, still smug from earlier, barely looked up. "We don't allow family members in the ER without." "You shut your mouth," Jacob said coldly. The authority in his voice cut through the room like a blade. Dr. Peters blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" Jacob stepped forward, his posture unwavering. "Are you aware that denying emergency care to a critical patient is not only unethical but illegal under the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act?" Dr. Peters swallowed. We have policies." Jacob's voice dropped to a lethal calm. "Policies? Policies don't override federal law. You left a dying man on the street because of a hospital bill. Do you know what that makes you?" Dr. Peters opened his mouth, but Jacob wasn't finished. "A defendant." Dr. Peters paled. Just then, Susan Hall entered the ER. "What's going on?" Jacob turned his laser-sharp glare on her. "You." Susan stiffened. "Who are you?" Jacob reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek leather business card case. He flipped one out and slid it onto the counter in front of her. She picked it up, and her face went white. "Jacob Carter, ESQ. Civil Rights Attorney Carter and Associates." Jacob smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "You made a grave mistake today, Ms. Hall. You violated the law. You put a man's life in danger. And you will be held accountable." Susan stammered, I don't think you understand." Jacob cut her off. "Oh, I understand perfectly. I understand that by tomorrow morning, this hospital will be on the front page of every major news outlet for its gross negligence and racial discrimination." Dar. Peters started sweating. This isn't discrimination." Jacob's smile was predatory. A 72-year-old black man was denied life-saving care and dumped on the street because you assumed he couldn't pay. And you're telling me it's not discrimination? Silence. Susan looked trapped. Jacob leaned in. "Now, let me tell you how this is going to go. Right now, you will provide a full written admission of your actions. You will also prepare a public statement accepting responsibility." Susan swallowed hard. "And if we refuse?" Jacob's smile sharpened. "Then I sue this hospital into the ground." Dr. Peters looked at Susan in panic. We can't afford that." Susan knew it. She knew exactly who Jacob Carter was. His name alone sent entire corporations into chaos. If he sued, they would lose. Her hands trembled. What do you want?" Jacob's voice was ice. "First, an immediate investigation into every single patient you've turned away. Second, a full reversal of your policies on treating uninsured patients." Susan nodded quickly. "And third." Jacob took a slow step forward. "You're going to fire Dr. Alan Peters." Dr. Peters gasped. "Wait, what? You can't." Susan turned to him. Her voice was final. "You're done." Dr. Peters' mouth opened and closed, but he saw it in her eyes. It was over. Michael crossed his arms, watching the man who had thrown his father onto the street crumble. And he didn't feel a single ounce of pity. A fight for justice. A long-awaited reckoning. The tension in the hospital's emergency room was thick, hanging like a storm cloud ready to explode. The once confident Dr. Alan Peters now stood frozen in place, his face drained of all color. Just moments ago, he had smugly dismissed Thomas Carter, tossing an elderly man onto the street as if his life held no value. Now, that decision had come back to haunt him. Jacob Carter, one of the most renowned civil rights attorneys in the country, had just delivered an ultimatum: either St. Anthony's Hospital fired Dr. Peters and reversed its inhumane policies, or they would face a lawsuit that would dismantle their entire administration. And there was no doubt about it, Jacob would win. Susan Hall, the hospital's administrator, looked trapped, her eyes darting between Jacob and Dr. Peters. She knew she had no choice. She turned to the disgraced doctor, her voice cold. "You're fired." Dr. Peters stumbled back as if he'd been physically struck. What? You can't. You've left me no choice, Susan snapped, her mask of authority cracking under the weight of impending disaster. You broke federal law, you ignored basic medical ethics, and now you've put this hospital in the middle of a legal nightmare. His hands clenched into fists. But I was just following our policies. Jacob took a step forward, his voice low and lethal. And now, you're going to pay for it. Michael, who had been standing in rigid silence, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of fury underneath. You didn't just refuse treatment, he said, staring directly into Peter's eyes. You threw my father onto the street, knowing he could die. Dr. Peters' mouth opened, but nothing came out. There was no excuse he could make that would erase what he had done. Michael's eyes burned with rage. You're a disgrace to your profession. And I promise you, this won't be the last you hear from me. The doctor swallowed hard, but no one defended him. Not the nurses. Not the hospital administrator. Not even security. Because deep down, they all knew he was guilty. Justice begins. Just as the confrontation reached its boiling point, the doors to the emergency room burst open. A crowd had formed outside, patients, hospital staff, and even reporters who had caught wind of the chaos. A young black reporter pushed through the crowd, a microphone clutched in her hand. "Mr. Carter," she called out, her camera crew right behind her. "Is it true that your father was denied medical care because of his insurance status?" Jacob turned to face the cameras, his sharp gaze unwavering. "That is exactly what happened." The reporter's eyes widened. "And is it also true that he was forcibly removed from the hospital?" Jacob's voice was steel. "Yes. And let me make something clear to every single person watching this right now, this isn't just about my father." He turned to face the growing crowd, his voice rising. "This is about every elderly black man who has ever been turned away because the hospital assumed they weren't worth saving. Every struggling single mother who has been denied treatment because she couldn't afford it. Every person of color who has been ignored, mistreated, or discarded by a system that values profit over people." The crowd murmured in agreement, voices of anger and disbelief spreading through them. "This ends now," Jacob declared. "I am personally launching an investigation into St. Anthony's Hospital, and I promise you, there will be consequences." A murmur of approval and outrage swept through the spectators. Michael stepped forward. "My father is still fighting for his life," he said, his voice raw. "But we're not just going to fight for him, we're going to fight for every person this hospital has failed." The reporters ate it up. Cameras flashed, microphones were pushed forward, and suddenly, St. Anthony's was at the center of a scandal they couldn't escape. Susan Hall looked like she wanted to disappear. The battle moves to the courtroom. Later that evening, after ensuring Thomas had been safely transferred to a prestigious private hospital, Jacob and Michael sat in a conference room, papers spread across the table. The legal team had been assembled within hours. Jacob's firm didn't play games. Michael leaned forward. "We have enough evidence to bury them, right?" Jacob smirked. "More than enough." They had security footage of Thomas being thrown out, medical records proving he was in a critical condition, witness statements from patients and hospital staff. This wasn't just a lawsuit. This was a reckoning. "By the time we're done," Jacob said, leaning back, "St. Anthony's will either change its policies, or it won't exist." Michael nodded. He wasn't just fighting for his father now. He was fighting for justice. The fallout. The days that followed were chaotic. The hospital scrambled to do damage control, releasing statements of apology, promising internal reviews, and immediately firing multiple staff members, including Susan Hall. But it wasn't enough. Michael and Jacob pushed forward with the lawsuit, and it gained national attention. Civil rights organizations, healthcare advocates, and even politicians took notice. The pressure mounted. Soon, other patients came forward. Stories of neglect, racial discrimination, and outright cruelty surfaced. Some had lost loved ones because of medical neglect. Others had barely survived. St. Anthony's was exposed for what it was, a system designed to discard those who couldn't afford to fight back. The victory. Months later, the verdict came down. St. Anthony's was found guilty of medical negligence, racial discrimination, and violation of federal emergency care laws. The settlement was historic. Millions were awarded to past victims. New policies were implemented nationwide. Hospitals across the country were forced to re-evaluate their practices, fearful of becoming the next St. Anthony's. And most importantly, Michael's father, Thomas Carter, lived. His heart was weak, but his spirit was strong. As he watched his son and brother fight for justice, he realized his pain hadn't been in vain. Because now, no other elderly black man would be thrown onto the street and left to die. Michael sat beside his father one evening, watching the news. St. Anthony's was closing its doors for good. Thomas sighed. They finally learned, huh? Michael nodded. Too late for some. Thomas patted his son's hand. Not too late for the next generation. Michael smiled. His father was right. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about change. And they had won. Healing wounds, building legacies. A father's recovery. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air as Thomas Carter lay in his hospital bed, the beeping of monitors serving as a quiet reminder that he was still here, still alive. His frail hands rested on the blanket covering him, his dark skin contrasting with the stark white sheets. The room was private, a far cry from the cold, impersonal space he had been thrown out of weeks ago. The past months had been a whirlwind. From the humiliation of being discarded like trash to becoming the face of a national reckoning, Thomas had barely processed it all. But one thing was clear, his son had saved his life. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Michael stepped inside, carrying a bouquet of blue hydrangeas, Thomas's favorite. "You're spoiling me now," Thomas teased, his voice hoarse but warm. "You know I don't need flowers." Michael grinned as he placed the bouquet on the nightstand. "You say that, but I saw how you smiled last time. Thought I'd keep the streak going." Thomas chuckled, but then his face turned serious. "I saw the news." Michael sighed, pulling a chair close to the bed. "It's been intense." Thomas nodded. "Son, I know what you did. What you and Jacob fought for. And I want to tell you something." Michael leaned in, ready to listen. "I never wanted you to carry my burdens," Thomas admitted. "I never wanted you to be angry for me. But you took the fight to them, and I want you to know, I'm proud of you. You turned my suffering into something powerful." Michael swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. He paused, trying to find the words. "I just couldn't let them get away with it. I couldn't let them treat you like you didn't matter." Thomas reached for his son's hand. "And because of you, they won't be able to do it to anyone else." The room fell into a comfortable silence, both men reflecting on everything that had transpired. Then, Thomas chuckled. Michael raised an eyebrow. "What?" "I always knew you'd be a fighter," Thomas mused. "You were stubborn as a boy. Wouldn't even let me win at chess." Michael smirked. "That's because you taught me never to back down." Thomas nodded. "And look where it got us." Beyond the courtroom, a call for change. While St. Anthony's Hospital had shut down, the fight wasn't over. Michael and Jacob had uncovered a system-wide problem, and with their newfound platform, they refused to let it die down. Jacob called for a congressional hearing to address racial disparities in emergency care, and Michael, though reluctant at first, agreed to testify. Days later, he stood before a panel of senators, cameras broadcasting his testimony nationwide. "My father nearly died," Michael said, his voice firm but controlled. "Not because of an accident. Not because of an unavoidable medical complication. But because a doctor looked at him, saw his skin color, and decided he wasn't worth saving." Murmurs spread through the room. "I refuse to accept that this is just the way things are," Michael continued. "We need accountability. We need real consequences. And if hospitals won't make the changes themselves, then we must force them to." His words sent ripples through the nation. Soon, new legislation was proposed. Hospitals that engaged in discriminatory practices would lose federal funding, doctors who denied care without medical justification would face immediate review and potential license revocation, and policies ensuring equal treatment for all patients were drafted into law. The tide was turning. The unexpected guest. One evening, as Michael and Jacob met for coffee at a small cafe, a woman approached their table hesitantly. She was older, her blonde hair pulled back into a neat bun, her blue eyes filled with hesitation. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice shaking. "Are you Michael Carter?" Michael nodded warily. "Yes. Can I help you?" She took a deep breath, visibly nervous. I was a nurse at St. Anthony's," she admitted. I was there that day." Jacob tensed, ready for another confrontation. But instead of hostility, the woman's face crumpled. Tears welled in her eyes. I should have spoken up," she whispered. "I saw what they did to your father. I knew it was wrong. I didn't stop it." Michael's expression softened. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I was scared of losing my job. She swallowed hard. "But I was wrong. And I want to do something about it. Please, tell me how I can help." Michael and Jacob exchanged glances. Then, Michael pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "Come work with us," he said. "We're building something better. The legacy begins." Months later, the Carter Foundation for Medical Equity was established. Its mission? To hold hospitals accountable. To advocate for those who had been ignored. To change the system from the ground up. It wasn't just a victory in court. It was a movement. Michael sat in his father's hospital room one evening, laptop open, reviewing the foundation's latest progress. Thomas watched him with a proud smile. "You did it," he murmured. "You turned pain into power." Michael looked up. "We did it," he corrected. Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. "No, son. You did." Michael smiled. Because for the first time in a long time, he believed it, too. A new dawn. A father's homecoming. It had been 6 months since Thomas Carter was discharged from the hospital, a moment that had felt like a miracle after all he had endured. As Michael pulled up to his father's home, he felt an odd mix of relief and apprehension. So much had changed. The once small legal fight had turned into a national movement. Their story had sparked outrage, but it had also inspired action. Michael opened the car door and walked around to the passenger side, helping his father out. Though Thomas was still recovering, he was stronger now. His steps were firmer, his posture more upright. The frail man who had been cast aside like nothing was now walking with the dignity he had always carried. The neighborhood had come out to welcome him home. A dozen familiar faces, from the old barbershop owner to the local pastor, stood outside, clapping and cheering. A massive "Welcome home, Mr. Carter" banner stretched across the porch. Thomas stopped at the foot of his driveway, overwhelmed. He looked at Michael. "Did you plan this?" Michael shook his head, smiling. "No, Dad. They did." Tears welled in Thomas's eyes as Mrs. Rodriguez, his elderly neighbor, stepped forward with a covered dish. "I made you my special casserole," she said warmly. "You need to keep your strength up." "Welcome back, sir," someone else called out. "We missed you, Thomas," another voice added. It was more than a homecoming. It was a reminder that he mattered, that despite what those doctors had tried to make him believe, he was valued, respected, loved. As Thomas stepped forward, embracing his community, Michael felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't just about fighting for justice anymore. It was about rebuilding what had been broken. And they were just getting started. A growing movement. The Carter Foundation for Medical Equity was booming. With the national spotlight still on them, funding had poured in. Donations came from everyday citizens, celebrities, and even a few prominent politicians who wanted to align themselves with the cause. Michael and Jacob had turned the foundation into more than just a watchdog for corrupt hospitals. They were creating real change. Lawsuits had been filed against multiple hospitals across the country. An anonymous hotline had been set up for whistleblowers in the medical field. A scholarship program was launched for Black and minority medical students, ensuring more diversity in the next generation of doctors. And perhaps most importantly, legislation was moving forward in Congress. Michael had been invited back to testify, this time not as a grieving son, but as a leader. He stood before lawmakers once again, no longer just demanding change but proposing solutions. The next time a Black man walks into an ER, he shouldn't have to wonder if he'll be treated as a patient or discarded as an inconvenience, he declared in his speech. We need to rebuild trust in our healthcare system. And that starts today. The bill, nicknamed the Carter Medical Equity Act, was set to pass with bipartisan support. It was happening. Real change. A reckoning for St. Anthony's. Michael had one last piece of unfinished business, the hospital that had nearly killed his father. St. Anthony's was gone, its doors shut permanently. The staff had been scattered, many of the doctors fired or blacklisted from practicing medicine. But Dr. Reynolds, the man who had personally ordered Thomas's removal, hadn't faced true accountability yet. That was about to change. Michael and Jacob had worked tirelessly to gather evidence, interviewing nurses, patients, and former employees who had witnessed Reynolds' history of racial bias. It was worse than they thought. Reynolds had denied care to at least 15 Black patients over the years. Multiple wrongful death lawsuits had been buried. The hospital board had protected him, covering up his misconduct. Not anymore. With new lawsuits filed and the weight of public scrutiny on him, Reynolds had been forced to resign from medicine entirely. But Michael wasn't satisfied. He wanted to make sure no other doctor could do this again. So, alongside several advocacy groups, he pushed for a new database, a national registry of doctors who had been found guilty of racial bias, malpractice, or medical neglect. It was controversial. Some hospitals fought back, fearing lawsuits and backlash. But Michael and Jacob wouldn't back down. And soon, the registry became law. Hospitals would no longer be able to quietly rehire bad doctors. Their records would be public and permanent. Michael knew it wouldn't erase the past. But it would protect the future. A father's words, a son's promise. Late one evening, Michael sat on the back porch with his father, looking out at the stars. Thomas took a deep breath of the crisp night air, his eyes full of unspoken thoughts. You know, Thomas murmured, when they threw me out of that hospital. I thought I was going to die. Michael's hands clenched. Even now, the thought of it infuriated him. But I didn't, Thomas continued. And maybe I survived for a reason. Michael turned to him. I see what you've built, son. What you've done. And I want you to know, you've changed the world. Michael exhaled, the weight of everything settling on his shoulders. I just wanted justice, Dad. Thomas smiled. And you got so much more than that. The old man reached out, placing a firm hand on Michael's shoulder. You've built a legacy, Michael. One that will outlive both of us. Michael swallowed hard, emotion welling in his throat. He had spent so long fighting, so long carrying his father's pain. But for the first time, he saw it, the impact, the change, the future. And he wasn't done yet. The future beckons. Months passed, and the Carter Foundation continued to grow. A new chapter was opening. One afternoon, Michael walked into his office to find Jacob waiting for him with a knowing smirk. You're not gonna believe this, Jacob said, sliding a folder across the desk. Michael opened it. His eyes widened. It was a proposal to build an entirely new hospital, one that would be owned and operated by black doctors and healthcare professionals. A place where no one would ever be turned away. Think we can pull it off? Jacob asked. Michael grinned. Let's find out. A legacy of justice, a future of hope. Thomas Carter had once been thrown out like nothing. Now, his name would live on. The Carter Foundation, the new laws, the medical scholarship programs, it was all just the beginning. Michael had fought for his father. Now, he would fight for everyone. Because no one should ever have to wonder, will they treat me like a human? Not anymore. Not ever again.